If you stand on the shore of Lake Michigan on a beautiful morning, the first thing you'll notice isn't the skyline with its magnificent skyscrapers behind you. The first thing you'll notice is that you're standing right here, free, with no fences, no prohibitive signs, no private buildings, blocking your view of the vast lake. Nearly 50 kilometers of shoreline, all of it belonging to the people. In any other major American city, this scenario would be unthinkable. But here's the truly strange part. Chicago didn't just protect its lakefront. The city also has a street grid system so precise that an address can tell you exactly how many blocks you are from the center. They have an elevated subway system, back alleys that run throughout their residential neighborhoods, and architectural works that are studied by the entire world. A city with nearly 3 million people in its inner city, and almost 10 million in its metropolitan area, yet it operates like an intentionally designed machine. The question isn't what Chicago did. The real question is why Chicago could do it, when every other city couldn't. And the answer begins not with a brilliant decision, but with a total disaster. Imagine you're living in Chicago on October 8th, 1871. A fire started in the southwest of the city. Within 2 days, that fire burned down nearly 9 square kilometers of buildings, destroyed the entire downtown area, and left more than 100,000 people homeless. Nearly 1/3 of Chicago's population at the time was left without a place to live. This is what people would call an unrecoverable disaster. And historical reality confirms this in almost every case. Philadelphia never fully recovered from its major fires. After the earthquake and fire of 1906, San Francisco took decades to rebuild, and the final result still bore the marks of a city that was patched up rather than reborn. The world's urban history teaches us that a complete disaster usually marks a decline, not a resurgence. But Chicago was different. And to understand why, we need to understand what the fire truly created, not a pile of rubble, but a blank slate. In urban studies, a blank slate is rarer than any other resource. Large cities often have to develop within the framework of decisions made centuries ago, roads that curve along old cowpaths, neighborhoods shaped by colonial-era property lines, underground pipes, and old railway lines that can't be moved. The physical history of a city is the heaviest burden that any urban planner must bear. The fire of 1871 wiped that burden away. Chicago did not delay. Immediately, the city issued a ban on wooden construction downtown. All new buildings had to be made of steel and stone. This wasn't merely a fire prevention measure. It was a declaration of identity. Chicago would become a permanent modern city built to last. But the ban on wood was just the starting point. What truly shaped Chicago was something that came 38 years later, when an architect named Daniel Burnham published a document that came to be known as the Plan of Chicago. This was one of the first complete master plans for an entire metropolitan region in American history. But what was more important than its scale was the philosophy behind it. Burnham is famous for the saying he considered the guiding principle for all his work: make no little plans. They have no magic to stir men's blood. He wasn't just talking about architecture. He was talking about the collective psychology of a city. And here lies the core paradox that we need to stop and think about. Most major urban plans in the world share the same fate. They are published with great excitement and then shelved because they're too expensive, too complicated, or simply because no one follows through after a change in administration. The Plan of Chicago did not follow that path. Chicago actually built most of what Burnham laid out, and the core principles of that plan have continued to guide the city's development for over a century. Why? Why was Chicago able to do what most cities could not? The answer lies in the 4 principles that Burnham established, which Chicago committed to following like an urban constitution. The city needs organized structure instead of chaotic growth. Beauty is as important as practical function. Public space is essential for everyone, rich or poor. And planning for decades to come is far better than reacting to immediate needs. These 4 principles might sound simple, but try reading them again and think about the cities you know. How many cities truly follow all 4 of these principles, not just for one leader's term, but for over 100 years? That's when we begin to understand that Chicago's story isn't just a story about architecture or planning. It's a story about how a city can choose who it wants to be, and then stick to that choice across generations. But before we delve deeper into that story, let's start with the most fundamental element of any city: its streets. If you've ever tried to find your way around Boston, you know the feeling. Streets that curve and twist, change their names midway, and end abruptly without any warning. This isn't by accident. Boston's streets largely follow old paths from colonial times, including some that are said to have originated as cow paths. Lower Manhattan, the financial heart of America, is a maze of narrow alleys laid out in the 17th century and never reorganized. Chicago did the complete opposite. The entire city is organized from a single intersection, where State Street crosses Madison Street. From that point, each block represents 100 address numbers. If someone lives at address 4800 North, it means they are 48 blocks north of the center. You don't need a map to know where you are. You just need to know how to read numbers. But the street grid is just the surface of a much smarter system. Hidden behind Chicago's residential blocks is a network of alleys that runs down the middle of each one. Garbage trucks, delivery vehicles, and garage entrances are all routed through the back of the house. The street front is for people. The back is for all the practical activities. In most American cities, garbage trucks park right on the curb, blocking traffic lanes and cluttering the streets. In Chicago, that almost never happens in residential areas. And then, there's an interesting detail. Chicago's street grid has a few diagonal streets that cut across at odd angles. They look like design flaws in an otherwise perfect system, but in reality, they are old Native American trading routes that existed long before the city was built. Chicago didn't erase them, but integrated them into the modern grid, because people had used them for centuries, and there was no reason to get rid of something that worked. This is how Chicago thinks. Not theoretical perfection, but practical down to the last detail. But no matter how perfect the street grid was, it wasn't enough for a city with an exploding population. Chicago needed to build up. And this is where the city changed not only itself, but the way people build cities all over the world. Before Chicago's architects began to experiment, there was a hard physical limit to how high a building could be. If you wanted to build 10 stories high using traditional brick and stone, the ground floor walls had to be thick enough to support the entire weight above. And the thicker the walls, the less usable space there was inside. At a certain point, adding more floors meant losing so much usable space that the effort became pointless. Chicago architects solved this problem with an idea that was both simple and revolutionary. Instead of having the walls bear the entire load, they built an internal steel frame to act as a skeleton. The walls were now just a protective skin, not the load-bearing structure. And when the walls no longer had to bear weight, you could build as high as you wanted while maintaining maximum usable space on every floor. In 1885, the home insurance building was completed using this method. This is widely considered to be the world's first true skyscraper. This innovation spread across the globe because it solved a problem that every growing city was facing. Almost every tall building constructed today, anywhere in the world, uses some version of the steel frame method that Chicago pioneered. This is the first time in this story, but not the last, that Chicago didn't just solve its own problem, but inadvertently invented a solution for all of humanity. In 1893, the World's Fair was held in Chicago, introducing the city's architectural innovations to an international audience. Chicago became the place where architects and planners from around the world came to learn. But right in the midst of this building boom, Burnham made his most important decision not about what to build, but about what absolutely not to build. This is where the story gets really interesting. In most major American cities, coastal, lakeside, or riverfront land is the most valuable, and so it usually ends up in private hands. New York built a wall of piers and warehouses along its shoreline. Miami Beach is lined with luxury hotels and high-end condos along its waterfront. In Los Angeles, while the beaches are technically public, surrounding development has blocked access, making them difficult for ordinary people to reach. Burnham looked at the Lake Michigan shoreline and saw something entirely different. He called it Chicago's greatest natural asset, and declared that it must belong to all the people, not just those wealthy enough to buy lakefront land. But this was not a simple declaration. It was a legal and civic battle that lasted for decades. Developers wanted the lakefront, commercial interests wanted the lakefront, and many politicians were willing to sell it off for the tax revenue. But the people of Chicago, time and time again, chose to keep the lakefront public. Today, you can walk, bike, or relax along the lake on 40 out of 47 kilometers of shoreline without encountering a single gate or private property sign. In a country where the real estate market puts a price on everything, This is an achievement so extraordinary, it's almost hard to believe. But the paradox here isn't just an ethical or political one. Economically, the decision to keep the lakefront public actually ended up increasing the property values of the entire city surrounding it. Because when the lakefront belongs to everyone, every part of the city has access to that asset. And an asset that millions of people can use for free is far more valuable than one enjoyed by only a few hundred wealthy residents. Chicago didn't sacrifice economic gain to protect its lakefront. Chicago created greater economic gain by doing the right thing. The Chicago River underwent a similar transformation over decades, from an industrial channel choked with warehouses and pollution to a river walk where people can enjoy the scenery and urban atmosphere. The city adopted the motto Urbs in Horto, meaning city in a garden, and used it not just as a marketing slogan, but as a genuine commitment that guided every development decision. However, the most beautiful public space in the world is meaningless if people can't get to it. And this is where the geography of time begins to play a crucial role. Chicago shaped much of its urban fabric before the automobile came to dominate American life. Its street grid, downtown density, and public transit system were all built in an era when people got around by walking, streetcar, and train. When the automobile became common, Chicago adapted to accommodate it, but didn't tear down its existing structure to give it absolute priority. That might sound simple, but look at what happened in almost every other major American city after World War II. The Great Highway boom of the 1950s and 1960s sliced through long-established neighborhoods, flattened historic districts, and replaced downtowns with massive parking lots. Public transit systems were left to decay under the assumption that everyone would drive everywhere. Suburbs sprawled endlessly, with no transportation options other than the private automobile. Houston built endless suburbs with virtually no public transit. Los Angeles created so much sprawl that an hour-long commute became perfectly normal. Atlanta designed a metro area where owning a car is an absolute necessity for basic activities like grocery shopping or getting to work. Chicago took a different path. Its elevated train system, known as the L, connects the city's neighborhoods in ways that make living without a car entirely feasible. Chicago maintained significantly fewer expressways than other major cities, while Houston and Los Angeles were building vast freeway networks. Decisions made decades ago continue to define what sets Chicago apart from almost every other major American city today. And this is the most important thing we need to pause and really understand. No single decision created Chicago. There wasn't a single moment of genius, no single enlightened politician, no magical source of funding. What created Chicago was a chain of decisions made continuously, over generations, by different administrations, all bound by a common framework set out by Burnham at the beginning of the 20th century. This is the point that most people miss when analysing Chicago's success. They focus on the specific projects on the L, on the lakefront, on the street grid. But all of those things are just symptoms. What was the root cause? The cause was a city that learned how to commit to a long-term vision, even when that commitment caused short-term inconvenience. Protecting the lakefront meant losing potential tax revenue from prime real estate. Building and maintaining the L was more expensive than just building more highways. Maintaining the back alley grid required maintenance costs that many cities were unwilling to pay. Every right decision came with a short-term cost. And Chicago, time and time again, chose to pay that cost. Why? There's an interesting explanation related to geography. Chicago didn't have a choice about its location. The city is located at the southwestern tip of Lake Michigan, a geographic position that made it a natural gateway between the American East and West. Before trains existed, this was where all the trade routes converged. After the advent of the railroad, Chicago became the largest rail hub in North America. Geography gave this city an economic importance that no other place in the Midwest had. But geography also gave Chicago a challenge. You can't expand Lake Michigan. The city could only grow in 3 directions. That pressure forced Chicago to think about density and efficiency from the very beginning, in a way that cities with endless room to expand never had to. Houston could just keep expanding into the endless Texas prairie. Los Angeles could spread along the coast and into the inland valleys. Phoenix could swallow up the Arizona desert, mile after mile. Those cities never had to learn how to build well, because they could always just build more. Chicago didn't have that luxury. Lake Michigan was the eastern wall, and that wall, paradoxically, was the best thing that ever happened to the city. But geography doesn't explain everything. Many cities have similar geographical constraints without becoming Chicago. San Francisco is surrounded by the Bay, yet it still struggles with chronic planning issues. Manhattan is an island, and those constraints didn't stop it from becoming a maze of chaotic building decisions. What makes Chicago different is a specific combination of three factors that don't often occur together. First, complete disaster. The fire of 1871 didn't just destroy buildings, it wiped out the land, power structure, and the expectations of what couldn't be changed. When everything had burned down, no one could say, "You can't touch this because I've invested in it." Second, a vision that arrived at the right moment. Burnham didn't just have a good idea. He published the plan in 1909, when Chicago was at the peak of its confidence and ambition following the success of the World's Fair. The city was feeling like it could do anything, and Burnham harnessed that emotion to turn a vision into a collective commitment. Third, and most importantly, was the mechanism for execution. The Burnham Plan was more than just an ideal written down. It was encoded into law, into building regulations, into specific legal commitments that successive administrations couldn't easily undo. When protecting the lakefront becomes law, not just policy, then politicians who want to sell off the lakefront can't do so even if they want to. This is a lesson that urban planners around the world learn from Chicago but often fail to implement. A good vision isn't enough. You need mechanisms to protect that vision from the erosion of short-term interests across generations. When you put it all together, we start to see a clearer picture. Chicago isn't a well-designed city because it's rich. The city wasn't wealthier than New York or Los Angeles when its most crucial decisions were made. Chicago is well-designed because it was forced to think systematically by its geography, because it was lucky enough to have a disaster strike at the right time when it was young and flexible enough to start over, and because it had leaders wise enough not just to dream, but to build the mechanisms to turn that dream into a lasting reality. The comparison with other cities reveals a stark, almost frightening difference. Houston has almost no zoning laws, which means an industrial plant can be built right next to a residential area without any restrictions or planning oversight. The entire metropolitan area sprawls outwards, with almost no public transportation, making the city impossible to navigate without a car. Phoenix sprawls across hundreds of square miles of desert, prioritizing endless expansion over dense development. New York City has incredible density and an extensive subway system, but it grew organically over centuries without the kind of comprehensive regional planning that Chicago implemented. Each of those cities reflects its decisions, or lack thereof, and Chicago reflects the opposite. What happens when a city truly commits to a long-term vision and creates the mechanisms to enforce it? But the story doesn't end there, and this is where we need to ask the harder questions. Chicago today faces challenges that no plan from the last century could have fully anticipated. The inner city population is declining, while the suburbs continue to grow. Economic inequality is creating areas within the city that Chicago's famed urban prosperity doesn't reach. Climate change raises questions about the future of a city, dependent on the world's largest freshwater lake. And this is the final paradox of the Chicago story. The very things that made this city great, the commitment to a long-term vision, the ability to sacrifice short-term gains, the mechanisms that protect crucial decisions are precisely what Chicago will need more than ever in the coming decades. The question is no longer whether Chicago can repeat the achievements of the last century. The question is whether a city born from the ashes of a disaster has the strength to reinvent itself once more in the face of 21st century challenges, or if that magic only happens once in a city's history. And if Chicago finds the answer to that question, the next lesson the world learns from them will be even more important than anything that has happened since 1871.